So by way of introduction to this panel, let me just read to you a paragraph from the Peace and Planet call from last year. We issue this call at a critical juncture in history, a moment when the unresolved tensions of a deeply inequitable society, great power ambitions, and the destructive effects of an unsustainable economic system are exploding into overlapping crises. Tensions among nuclear-armed countries are rising amid circumstances that bear worrisome resemblances to those that brought us the world wars of the last century. For the first time in the nuclear age, we are in a sustained global economic crisis that is deepening the gulf between rich and poor in a starkly two-tier world. Both climate change and fossil fuel-based economies generate conflicts within and among states. Extreme economic inequality and economic policies that create it, NATO's aggressive expansion, struggles over diminishing fossil fuels, food price spikes, and crop failures drive wars and revive arms races from Iraq to Syria, to Ukraine, to South Asia, and the Western Pacific. We face a moment in which policies that benefit a fraction of the world's population feed conflicts that could precipitate catastrophic wars, even nuclear wars, and in which the power to make war is wielded by largely unaccountable elites. I'll introduce our two speakers in just a moment, but I just wanted to say a few introductory remarks about NATO because I don't assume that everybody knows what NATO is. It isn't really widely discussed or understood in the United States. So I thought I would just read you some quotes from the NATO official website to set up our speakers to go for the jugular. It says, a short history of NATO. It is often said that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded in response to the threat posed by the Soviet Union. This is only partially true. In fact, the alliance's creation was part of a broader effort to serve three purposes: deterring Soviet expansionism, forbidding the revival of nationalistic militarism in Europe through a strong North American presence on the continent, and encouraging European political integration. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed on April 4th, 1949. In the treaty's renowned Article 5, the new allies agreed, quote, an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all, and that following such an attack, each ally would take, quote, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force in response. And then under NATO's purpose, NATO strives to secure lasting peace in Europe based on common values of individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Since the outbreak of crises and conflicts beyond the borders of NATO member countries can jeopardize this objective, the alliance also contributes to peace and stability through crisis management operations and partnerships. Essentially, NATO not only helps to defend the territory of its members, but engages where possible and when necessary to project its values further afield, prevent crises, manage crises, stabilize post-conflict situations, and support reconstruction. NATO also embodies the transatlantic link by which the security of North America is tied to the security of Europe. Just a word about who are NATO's members. There are now 28 members, but initially there were 12. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. There was a gap until 1952 when Greece and Turkey joined and so on, and Joseph will pass out a list of all the members so I don't take up valuable time doing that. Going on, during the Cold War, NATO focused on collective defense and the protection of its members from potential threats emanating from the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, along with the rise of non-state actors affecting international security, many new security threats emerged. NATO now focuses on countering these threats by utilizing collective defense and managing crisis situations. Okay, so here's something that's very fundamentally important. NATO nuclear weapons are a core component of NATO's overall capabilities for deterrence and defense alongside conventional and missile defense forces. Highlights: the fundamental purpose of NATO's nuclear forces is deterrence. Deterrence based on an appropriate mix of nuclear and conventional capabilities remains a core element of NATO's overall strategy. Nuclear weapons are a core component of the alliance's overall capabilities for deterrence and defense alongside conventional and missile defense forces. NATO is committed to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, but as long as nuclear weapons exist, it will remain a nuclear alliance. And those principles are stated over and over again in documents over the years. I want to also make sure everybody knows that the United States is the only nation with nuclear weapons deployed on foreign soil, with approximately 180 nuclear weapons stationed at 6 NATO bases in Italy, Germany, Turkey, Belgium, and the Netherlands. As stated in the 2010 strategic concept, the supreme guarantee of the security of the Allies is provided by the strategic nuclear forces of the alliance, particularly those of the United States, the independent strategic nuclear forces of the United Kingdom and France, which have a deterrent role of their own, contribute to the overall defense and security of the Allies. And just to bring this right up to date, yesterday, foreign ministers from the nations participating in resolute support, that's the Afghanistan operation, agreed to sustain the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan beyond 2016 in a sign of strong commitment to the stability of the country. And just to sort of give you an idea of how active and massive this NATO operation is, each day, hundreds of civilian and military experts and officials come to NATO headquarters to exchange information, share ideas, and help prepare decisions when needed in cooperation with national delegations and the staff of NATO headquarters. And NATO will be having a summit in Warsaw, Poland, July 7th and 8th, with a counter-summit being organized in advance of the summit. So we have 2 speakers today, and as I understand it, the first one, Joseph Gerson, who I'll introduce in a moment, will kind of give a perspective from the global north, and Bahman Azad will give a perspective from the global south. So let me introduce them, and they can have at it. So Joseph Gerson, Dr. Joseph Gerson, who many of, not all of you know, is Director of Programs for the American Friends Service Committee's Northeast region and Director of AFSC's Peace and Economic Security Program. He focuses on preventing nuclear war and achieving nuclear weapons abolition, education and organizing for peaceful and just alternatives to U.S. militarization of the Asia-Pacific, and prevention of U.S. wars, focusing most recently on NATO, Ukraine, and Iraq. He is co-convener of the Peace and Planet International Network, which I described. He is a board member of the International Peace Bureau and serves on the steering committee of the Middle Powers Initiative and the European-based No to NATO, No to War network. His books include Empire and the Bomb, How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World, and The Sun Never Sets, Confronting the Network of U.S. Foreign Military Bases. Joseph will be followed by Bahman Azad, who is a member of the Executive Board and Organizational Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council and NGO representative of the World Peace Council at the United Nations. Bahman is chair of the Iran Working Group of Veterans for Peace and co-founder of the International Campaign in Solidarity with the Iranian People's Green Movement. Bahman has done extensive research on the subject of the Middle East and Iran and has published numerous articles on these subjects, both in English and Persian languages, in various publications in the United States and Iran. His area of research also includes the political economy of capitalism and socialism, and his articles on this subject have appeared in such journals as Political Affairs and Nature, Society, and Thought. He is the author of the book Heroic Struggle, Bitter Defeat, Factors Contributing to the Dismantlement of the Socialist State in the USSR, published by International Publishers, New York. He has a master's degree in economics and a PhD in sociology, and is currently a professor of economics and sociology in New Jersey. So each of our presenters will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A and discussions. And just before we start, I'd like to pass around this sign-up sheet.
Thank you for coming. I have to say, I lived in Europe for 3 years after the Paris Peace Accords, lo these many years ago. And when I came back, I really wanted to do some writing about NATO as an imperial alliance, but frankly, I didn't have the chops then. And I'm a little bit closer, I think, to having those chops at the moment. So we'll see where it takes us here. First of all, I want to underline really the dangerous moment that we live in. Some people are talking about a new Cold War, but I think it's much better to understand it in the context of having parallels to the period leading up to World War I, except this time we have nuclear weapons. So so on the back side of the paper we passed out, but just to describe some of those similarities. We're in a period of rising and declining major powers, arms races with new technologies, resurgent nationalism, certainly among the great powers, territorial disputes, intense resource competition, complex alliance arrangements, including NATO, economic integration and competition. And to remember, in the period leading up to World War I, people thought the level of economic integration at the time made war unthinkable. And we have a number of wild card actors out there. And certainly NATO is a major factor in all of this. As we've been reading here in the press about Putin and Russia's responses, what we haven't thought about is the fact that beginning with Bill Clinton, the United States violated the agreement negotiated between Bush and Gorbachev that Germany could be reunified on terms acceptable, basically the frame of West Germany, in exchange for NATO not moving a centimeter closer to Moscow. Well, now NATO is on Russia's borders. And if you were a Russian with any sense of history, you'd be remembering Napoleon, you'd be remembering the Kaiser, you'd be remembering Hitler. And so I think it's a perception of real danger on their part. I want to thank Jackie for that overview, and I want to put it in a little bit of a framework that kind of reaffirms some of what was on that NATO page. You want to take it from the horse's mouth. So Zbigniew Brzezinski was National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter. And he wrote, I think, a very important book, kind of a primer for his students, basically a primer about how to maintain the U.S. empire, called The Grand Chessboard. And what he explains is that when you think geopolitically, the United States, like Britain before it, is an island power. That whoever controls the Eurasian heartland is the world's dominant power. And so as an island power, the United States has to project power, if it's going to be an imperial power, on the periphery of Eurasia. And so what we have is, he said, you need to have it on the eastern, southern, and western periphery of Eurasia. And now with the melting of the ice cap, we also see it to the north with the pressures and the militarization in the Arctic. So you have NATO as the U.S. toehold on the western periphery of Eurasia. We've had for so many years U.S. hegemony in the Middle East, and the presence in Afghanistan on the southern base, and then we have the military alliance with Japan, the military bases in Korea, Philippines, and you have that surrounding on those elements. Interestingly, in his book, Brzezinski refers to U.S. NATO allies as vassal states. Vassal states. And he explains that there's a little bit of a quid pro quo here. The vassals get something out of this in exchange for our military bases there, or capping of German militarism, or power economically and politically across Europe. And what he says is the reward is diplomatic support. They get co-production of weapons and some of those weapons profits, intelligence sharing, and they get privileged access to development and construction contracts. Think in terms of Kuwait, think in terms of Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, Afghanistan. They get privileged access to oil, and they get low-cost guarantees of quote-unquote security. Of course, as we see with Trump, and before that Obama, and before that Gates and everybody else, the demands that they pay more, minimum of 2% of their GNP, which they're not particularly happy about. Jackie made reference to the coming summit in Poland, and in a sense, this kind of reflects some of the amazing contradictions of the so-called Alliance for Democracy. If you've been following the press, you've been seeing the hard drift to the right in Europe. First Hungary, which basically has a neo-fascist government, and now the same in Poland, where you have a religiously based far right-wing government, kind of a throwback to the government of the 1920s. It's so bad that the European Parliament has passed a resolution expressing their deep concern, and basically the step before sanctions, because you basically have one-party rule, the removal of the power of the Supreme Court, and movement toward a fascist state. In terms of other recent developments, to appreciate that the United States is now quadrupling what it spends for our military presence in Europe, another $3.4 billion. We're moving, 14,000 more troops along the Russian border, ostensibly as tripwires. And you've been reading about the aggressive military exercises. And I have to say, while the United States has done more than its share on these aggressive exercises, the Russians have as well. So you have the recent example of the U.S. destroyer in the Baltic, and the Russians kind of doing simulated attacks against the destroyer. So the war games on both sides have been disturbing, to say the least. We've had nuclear saber rattling on both sides, and let's just wonder what's going to happen if a overly patriotic and nationalist, adventurous 20-year-old on one of our ships decides, I don't like seeing that plane here, I'm going to shoot down a Russian plane. And then imagine how that can move. Or similarly, if the Russians do that to the United States. Saying a little bit about the history, interesting that the NATO page now says that containment of the Soviet Union was not the only reason that NATO was created. In fact, it was created before the Warsaw Pact. It was created at a time when Russia had lost more than 20 million people in its war. It was a devastated country. In fact, if you read George Kennan's early book on American diplomacy, I think it's American Diplomacy 1898 to 1945, even Kennan said, look, the division of Europe is a function of the outcome of the war. The Russians drove the Nazis back even further east than Berlin, and the reality was that we had to accept the division of Europe. Certainly that the Russians were entitled, he thought, to having a buffer against the West, given their history. So to understand NATO as containing the Soviet Union, I think is more than a little bit off. They say it nicely in the page, but the reality was to cap German militarism, to basically integrate these countries into the U.S. system. One thing they didn't talk about was the economic dimensions of NATO. Its charter says that member nations, quote, will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between any and all of them. To appreciate that our bases there have also served our interventions in the Middle East. Ramstein in Germany is a huge base, and it's been the center of both the logistics and much of the war in Afghanistan, and now for the AFRICOM, the U.S. military presence in Africa. And there's been very little reported here in the United States about the increasing and very interventionary roles of the U.S. military in Africa. Let me see what this is here. Sorry. Yeah. So Jackie made reference to NATO as a nuclear alliance. Simply to quote from it, it said that NATO should remain secure and reliable nuclear forces with widely shared responsibility for deployment and operational support. Any change of this policy, including geographic distribution of NATO nuclear deployments in Europe, should be made by the alliance as a whole. Broad participation in the non-nuclear allies is an essential sign of transatlantic solidarity. So just a couple of things to parse from that. To say that countries like Netherlands, whose parliament just voted to oppose nuclear weapons, they cannot legally order the withdrawal of U.S. NATO nuclear weapons unless all of the nuclear weapon states say, okay. So this is a lever that the United States has played. The other has been that the U.S. has used its nuclear weapons as a way to prevent what they call decoupling of the United States and Western Europe over time. What more do I want to hit here? Yeah, and I guess just more recently, the Atlantic Council came out, I think it was last week, as it looks to the summit in Warsaw, saying that it's essential to, quote, improve NATO's nuclear plans and forces. They call for more realistic nuclear exercises, and they press the deployment of the B-61-12 nuclear weapon. Now, just to appreciate, the B-61s have been based in Europe for some time, but the B-61-12 is one of the new nuclear weapons being developed as part of the $1 trillion the United States is spending for the development of a whole new generation of nuclear weapons and their deployment systems. How bad is the B-61-12? Even former Secretary of Defense Perry is saying this is a weapon that's being designed to make nuclear weapons more usable. And the insanity of thinking that once one nuclear weapon has been used, that the escalation can be contained is madness. Let me say a little bit about the post-Cold War period. So with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO lost what had been its raison d'etre. It was, by all logic, it should have been retired. But instead it was repurposed. So you have, beginning with Clinton and Yeltsin, the United States taking advantage of weakened Russia, expanding the alliance to its borders. What's interesting is not only the NATO members, but to look at who are the partner nations. So you have Georgia, among others, and Ukraine as partner nations. And again, I think it was last week, NATO reiterated their desire to have Georgia and Ukraine eventually become members of NATO. And you have the deployment of so-called defensive weapons in Georgia. And of course, the role of the United States and the European Union in overthrowing the previous Ukrainian government and now pursuing and supporting the war there. Also to say on these partners, Sweden and Finland are now functionally members of NATO, even though they're not formally in, and that comes. If you look beyond that, you see NATO's Mediterranean dialogue, countries principally in North Africa and the Middle East, part of the system of global control, the Istanbul Cooperative Initiative, and then partners across the globe. So NATO partner Afghanistan, NATO partner Pakistan, and the roles of Australia and Japan, in particular, also the Republic of Korea, in terms of reinforcing that eastern toehold on Eurasia. What more to say here? Yeah. So what are we looking at as we approach the summit in Poland? On the one hand, the most recent Polish defense minister, that's the previous right-wing government, before we had the even more right-wing government. The defense minister said that, quote, Poland will play a leading regional role under U.S. patronage. One of the things that we see happening is the gravity, the center of the power of NATO moving further to the east from Berlin and from Germany. With Warsaw as the scene of the summit, in a sense, will be coordinating that new arrangement. We have the missile defenses being deployed. They just went active in Romania, and they're about to be, construction is about to begin in Poland. Now remember, for a long time, the rationale for these missile defenses was they were going to defend Europe against Iran, Iran that was getting the nuclear weapon. Well, we have a deal with Iran. There is going to be no Iranian nuclear weapon. The Russians, for a long time, have been saying that missile defenses are essentially part of a U.S. first strike nuclear policy. The idea is that we launch our extremely accurate ICBMs, our strategic missile forces, and With missile defenses, the idea is that any surviving second strike missiles coming back from Russia would be taken care of by missile defenses. So it's kind of the shield to reinforce the first strike sword. The Russians are not happy. And just to appreciate, I mean, I have no particular love for the Putin government. I have no particular love for Russian military policy. And Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on its nuclear arsenal. I mean, Putin said, you know, we considered the use of our nuclear arsenal to reinforce our presence in Crimea. But to understand from a Russian perspective, in addition to NATO moving to its borders, which is threatening enough, the United States has overwhelming conventional weaponry support, overwhelming cyber capabilities, and overwhelming space warfare capabilities. So the Russian leadership, its elite, feels besieged, and it's not an inappropriate response. Other things that we see happening, there's been description of what's called the arc of the alliance, the southern arc of the alliance, from the Iranian border through the Caucasus to Azerbaijan and Turkey. Remember, Turkey is a NATO ally. This is our NATO ally that was letting ISIS forces pass through pass through Turkey into Syria, basically becoming a very repressive, authoritarian, anti-democratic state, but it's a big part of NATO, bless them. There are all kinds of very massive military exercises, forward deployments now of ships in the Black Sea on Russia's border. Jackie was making reference to that. Military exercises in the Baltics and Scandinavia. Catch this one. We've had both Vice President Biden and President Obama talk about our sacred obligation to Romania and Moldova. Now, how many of our children are we prepared to sacrifice in our sacred obligation to the ostensibly democratic, forward-looking societies of Romania and Moldova? So, what do we expect coming out of the summit in Poland? As I said, it'll be the reinforcement of Poland as the foundation. We have a reinforcement. Remember, it was it Rumsfeld or Cheney who talked about with the expansion of NATO, we could now play old Europe against new Europe. And so we're going to have much more of that coming out of Poland, and we'll see that in practice. We're going to have increased demands here in the United States, from the United States, for increased NATO military spending. Now, to say that there is opposition, many in Europe are not exactly thrilled with NATO. They're not thrilled with the presence of our nuclear weapons there. They're not thrilled with the aggressive military games and the dangers that the United States and NATO are creating by its confrontation with Russia. A sense that in a number of cases, including Ukraine, the Russians are often more reasonable than we are. I mean, the idea of creating a neutral Ukraine was something that the United States refused to accept. So you've had now, since 2008 or so, a number of major demonstrations, counter-summit demonstrations and conferences. Each time there's a NATO summit. And I guess one thing I really didn't talk about, had meant to, was to talk about, beginning at the Portugal summit, the affirmation of the out-of-area doctrine. So basically, from the beginning of the Afghanistan war, wrapping up 1 minute, the NATO's focus with Russia down was out-of-area operations, with the Pentagon basically saying that a major function of NATO was to secure natural resources for the industrialized West. So what we're going to see with Poland is a recalibrating of that and a sharpened increase on its traditional role of confronting Russia. We'll be seeing in very right-wing Poland, there'll be a conference, there'll be a counter-summit conference, and there'll be demonstrations in the street. It's going to be interesting. It's a way to kind of raise up to people that what's going down there is not good, providing an opportunity such as this one for us to begin to educate about what NATO is, how it undermines our security, not only in terms of immediate dangers, but also just think of the money being spent for NATO. It's not being spent for our schools, it's not being spent for housing, it's not being spent for our infrastructure. So I hope that helps to at least get us started in understanding some of the foundations of NATO. And I guess I would just say that I'm sure Bahman and I and Jackie, where we are, would be happy to meet with local groups, be part of panels of events that you have, so we can help to educate our compatriots here as to what's really going down and what's in our interest. Thank you.
Yes, Jackie is right. Originally, it was raised that Joe will talk about NATO and North, Global North, and I will be talking about NATO and Global South. However, I decided to consider United States as part of Global South and talk about what's going on with NATO here and in the movement. I would like to shift gear instead of going into details of what NATO is all about and what it is doing. I want to get into the question of why is NATO doing what it is doing. And I think for us in the peace movement is the more important part, because we all of us more or less have seen what they have been doing. The question is what is driving them. And our view in the Peace Council has been for a long time that NATO is an imperialistic tool of Western powers. And it cannot be just looked at as an independent force in itself, but as a part and parcel of one single imperialist agenda for the 21st century. This is what we have been doing, trying to relay to people from the Peace Council side. And unfortunately, we have not been very successful so far to get the people to see the relationship between the NATO as an institution, organization, military creature, and the masters that are running it. And in our view, our failure, in a sense, partly is due to what we believe to be the legacy of the Cold War period. That for 70, 80, 90 years, people have been brought up to think in terms of a reductionist thing, in terms of good guys, bad guys. We are the good guys and the communists are the bad guys, and there's nothing in between, and there's no gray area. And this mentality is being presently promoted also by NATO in terms of whatever they're doing around the world. So every time you look at some action on the part of NATO or the US, military intervention, coup d'etat, anything else, you find another bad guy discovered somewhere. And that guy becomes the reason for aggression and war and invasion. We have witnessed this left and right since the collapse of Soviet Union, especially because now, before it was just labeling communists, labeling communists was enough. Right? But now they have to come up with new terms: terrorist, dictator, violator of human rights, violator of women's rights, as in Afghanistan they were talking about Taliban and other things. So they find some label to stick to some of these leaders or leaderships and justify aggression. The reason I'm saying it's the Cold War mentality is because we still haven't come out of the image that has been created in our minds about Eastern Bloc and the Communist Socialist Bloc, and we are still thinking in those terms. But we have gone far beyond that at this stage. Look at the bad guys that each time we have been presented that has led us to be silent in the face of an aggression, or semi-silent or hesitant. Look at Yugoslavia with Milosevic. Look at Panama with Noriega. Look at Afghanistan with Taliban. Look at Iran and the Ayatollah. Look at Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Look at Libya and Gaddafi. Look at Syria and Azad, Venezuela, Chavez, and now Maduro. Look at Ukraine, Yanukovych, Russia, Putin. And they are creating a new one every day. Wherever they want to go, this happens. And this usually pushes the peace movement, anti-war movement to hesitate in opposing these aggressions because they are afraid to be identified with these bad guys. They equate in our minds our opposition to aggression with support for some bad guy. And us being fearful of that label, withdraw usually or are hesitant in our opposition. That has been a serious weakness in the peace movement today in our view. The question is not whether these guys are good or bad, right? It's irrelevant. Who is bad guy and who is good guy? The definition of good guy, bad guy from our point of view, from peace movement point of view, from people's point of view is different from the definition of bad guy from the imperialist point of view. Okay, when they say bad guy, we think dictatorship, violation of human rights, oppression, violence, other things. When they look at bad guys, they are always the ones who are standing in the way of imperialist plans. That they are immediately becoming bad guys. Okay, so in that sense, they sell us one kind of definition of bad guy and act on a different definition of the bad guy. And we get confused in the middle and hesitate in our position. Look at the example. How many of us really oppose the attack on Libya? How many of us are really opposing, actively opposing now what's going on in Syria? Not all of us, definitely, right? And if there are people who are very active in support of Venezuela, but do nothing with regards to some other place, because they don't see the link that these actions are all part and parcel of the same singular imperialist strategy. And in fact, it has been outlined openly, and we have been disregarding it. There is another reason why they're pushing this good guy, bad guy image. And that's because they can find exactly to mask the relationship between the attack on Libya and what's going on in Ukraine as element of the same strategy. They want to provide an image or produce an image that each case is separate. We are doing this because of that particular bad guy for that particular reason, and not for a global strategy that we have behind the whole thing. Okay, so this good guy, bad guy mentality also serves as masking this unified imperialist strategy by pushing us in different directions, finding different reasons for different attacks and aggressions, not being able to link them together because Assad is different from Gaddafi, is different from somebody else, right? So as a result, we see it as separate issues rather than the single issue that is going on. Okay, so irrelevant, but important in terms of shaping our reactions. And we have to come out of that mentality. So for peace movement at this stage to really not be effective against NATO, but other manifestations of imperialist aggression, and militarism is not the only method and tool in the hands of imperialism. Finance capital operates behind the scenes in every way. We know that. They are killing people, as many people. Imperialism has killed more people in peacetime than wartime. We have to understand that. Through poverty, sickness, right? Homelessness, environmental pollution, wars, environmental impacts of wars. So the question is, we have to oppose, as a peace movement, the imperialist agenda in its totality, rather than just looking at Syria at one time, opposing that part, looking at Yugoslavia, looking at Gaddafi at another point, and just fighting it in piecemeal. We have to understand, once we see this coherent plan, we will be able to be proactive and not reactive. Not wait until they attack Libya, then we respond. When they're setting the stage for it, if you see the plan and you will see these are steps towards this part of this plan, you would be able to be proactive about it. Take preventive action, right? Rather than wait until it happens. And we have been reactive just because we are not looking at the whole picture, and we are being led, especially by imperialist media, in terms of what the top issue is today, rather than us knowing it from the imperialist agenda, what is the top issue today. Look at what's going on right now with Pivot to Asia, right? They're doing it piecemeal. They don't make it with a big bang so everybody knows, right? Aren't they talking about, wasn't Obama talking about dispatching more NATO forces towards China and the East? Is anybody objecting? Is anybody on the streets? No, because we see it as a small piece of action, right? Not related to anything else, just an act, a policy. But if you put it in that overall picture of NATO and imperialism, then you will see that this is a step towards another war that may come. The same thing that is happening on the borders of Russia. Okay, so once we have that general plan and strategy of imperialism led by the United States, we can then go beyond the appearances of things and go into the core causes of things and try to prevent future aggressions rather than responding to it after the fact. Okay, and if you are kind of not sure what this imperialist plan is, I would like to go read a few pieces of the document. Probably some of you are familiar with, and I've been accused of relying on it too much. But if you look at this document, if you haven't, you will see that every step that NATO, US, Western allies are taking in every corner of the world is to the letter of this document, as it was proposed in around 2000 by Project for the New American Century, neocons institution. And the document was called Rebuilding America's Defenses Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. And indeed, these are forces built up for new century. I'll go to some of these items, very brief. It's a 90-page document, a lot of it technical, but within it you will see the principles that are being set up. I go in a kind of I have reshuffled them to make sense out of the whole thing. And these are all quotes. The United States must shape a new century favorable to American interests. At present, the United States faces no global rival. There are, however, potentially powerful states dissatisfied with the current situation and eager to change it. Change U.S. domination, monopoly. Our defense strategy must be maintaining U.S. preeminence, precluding the rise of a great power rival, and shaping the international security order in line with the American principles and interests. Think about Pivot to Asia with regard to China and NATO moving to the borders of Russia, right? Great power rivals emerging. You don't want them. Today, the military's task is to expand the zones of democratic peace, quote unquote, to deter the rise or a new great power competitor. The Balkans and Southeastern Europe more generally present the major hurdle towards the creation of a Europe whole and free. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the delay in bringing security and stability to Southeastern Europe has prevented the consolidation of the victory in the Cold War. This is especially important in light of the nascent European moves towards an independent defense identity and policy. It is important that NATO not be replaced by the European Union, leaving the United States without a voice in European security affairs. These are, you see what's happening right now with NATO, right? The prospect in East Asia is that in East Asia will be an increasingly important region marked by the rise of Chinese power. Raising U.S. military strength in East Asia is the key to coping with the rise of China to great power status. It is now commonly understood that there are forces that may threaten America's ability to exercise its dominant military power. Potential rivals such as China are anxious to exploit the situation, while missile adversaries like Iran, Iraq, North Korea are rushing to develop ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, listen to this part, as a deterrent to American intervention, right, in the region. If an American peace is to be maintained, American peace, and expanded, it must have a secure foundation on unquestioned U.S. military preeminence. While withdrawing from the Balkans with peace would place American leadership in Europe, indeed, the viability of NATO in question. Further, these constabulary missions, you're talking advanced bases, demand American political leadership rather than that of the United Nations, meaning NATO should replace UN. Okay. I have two more to read. It's going to be quick. When their missiles are tipped with warheads, even weak regional powers have a credible deterrent again, regardless of the balance of conventional forces. A number of regimes deeply hostile to America, meaning imperialism, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, one by one they're going through them, pose a grave challenge to the American peace and military power. The ability to control this emerging threat through traditional non-proliferation treaties is limited. Forget NPT, right? Let's move on. Let's take the matters into our own hands, right? We cannot allow North Korea, Iran, Iraq, or similar states to undermine American leadership. And finally, the concluding part of this that was famously read and put up everywhere, and most importantly, none of this can be done absent some catastrophic catalyzing event like Pearl Harbor, right? So the whole plan is outlined here. They're not disguising anything. Compare that with what Jackie read from the NATO side, how they are presenting themselves publicly, and what the actual driving force is. And this is what we're dealing with. Our struggle against war should be our struggle against imperialism. No other way can do it. Thank you.
Thanks to both of our speakers, and thanks to both of them for keeping to time. We have time for some discussion. I would like to ask each person who speaks to please keep it brief. If you want to make a short comment, that's fine, or if you want to ask a question. Let's see how it goes. We want to have time for our speakers to respond. So let me call on people. And if you'd also identify yourself, that would be appreciated.
NATO is the most powerful military alliance in human history. Its purpose was to fight World War III against the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union ceased to exist, its purpose was to become the policeman of the whole world, and that's what it is. That's what it is. It was nuclearized in the 1950s. Its present function is now global, and its main enemy is not Russia, because Russia is a kind of crony capitalist state that has nuclear weapons and is essentially weak. Its main enemy in the world is the people's movements of the world, and also, I would say, China, which has been denigrated and marginalized by the left, but which remains a nation committed to the development of socialism. Not socialism, as many of us would define it, but a new mixed economy, market socialism, and that is why the Asian pivot is important, along with all these other developments where we see basically in Eastern Europe particularly, but also in Western Europe,
Norman?
Hitler's allies.
Okay.
Nazi fascism, Jew baiters, racists, militarists, on the march.
Okay,
NATO supports.
Thank you. Joseph, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I want a couple pieces I want to pick up on. First of all, just in terms of origins, there's the famous quotation from George Kennan, which I think is worth repeating for people here, which I think has been the foundation of U.S. policy for a very long time, which is that we have then about 50% of the world's wealth. Now it's about 22%, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the rising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we're going to have to deal with straight power concepts, and the less we're then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. Of course, this was right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, just in terms of foundations, and you go back to, really the, it's deep in the culture, right? I mean, it's the conquest of a continental empire. By 1890s, it's consolidated, and then the pursuit of an international empire. Where I would differ a little bit is to say that back when I was taught that international relations is analogous to the study of the rules of the game among mafia families. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, but I think we need to understand that we're in a period of competing capitalism, and I don't see too many good guys at the heads of states, which is not to say that we don't then challenge U.S. imperialism, but I don't think we need to see things in black or white. And I think there are ways in which we can affirm struggles for human rights and self-determination without attacking imperialism. So I would do that. Two more points I wanted to make. In my rush to get through my outline on time, I left out something which I think was fairly critical in terms of the transitions that we have, which is to say the war on Serbia. And to understand that in many ways, from the U.S. side, that was a manufactured war, that as bad as Milosevic was, to my perspective, the atrocities against Kosovars really didn't step up until after the war had really already begun. And if you go back, and Chomsky has written about this fairly clearly, the U.S. terms to Serbia, to Milosevic, were either he had to give NATO forces the full run of all of Serbia, or we would go to war. And no self-respecting head of state is going to accept that. There was a very interesting article in the May 1999 issue of Foreign Affairs, written by a man who teaches at Tufts University, Michael Glennon. And this is what he wrote about the Serbia-Kosovo war. He said, with little discussion and less fanfare, the world effectively, or the NATO effectively abandoned the old UN charter rules that strictly limit international intervention in local conflicts in favor of a new system that is much more tolerant of military intervention, but has few hard and fast rules. And we've seen this, kind of just built on, with the illegal war in Afghanistan, the illegal invasion of Syria, of Iraq, and the list goes on. Just a couple more points I wanted to make particularly around the pivot to Asia. And also we can go back, I mean, it's the May, I want to say it was May, would have been May 2001 issue of the New Yorker. There's a long interview with Cheney published there. They've not given much attention since. And in that, he's asked, is there a single defining dimension at work in the world today? And what he says is the world will soon be seeing us imposing the arrangement for the 21st century. And so, the 9/11 attacks provided the opening for them to attempt to do it, and to appreciate that in some ways Bush may have turned out to be our best anti-imperial president because of the failures. And the way in which he has built, if you will, kind of an anti-war sentiment among the mass of the population, and the disregard for the United States that's grown around the world, which is not to say we're not in trouble. But around the pivot, I think people have little understanding here of how foundational the U.S.-Japan military alliance is, to understand that that was imposed on the Japanese in secret as a term and condition for ending the military occupation in 1952, right? And we've built out from that. And so, now the head of state there is the grandson of a Class A war criminal who pushed through the extension of that, and Japan is moving to have, it really turned the clock back to the 1930s. With the pivot, and they've been pretty clear about this, the reaction has been thin. We have a working group on Asia-Pacific issues, and more people on the West Coast than here dealing with it. But the Pentagon's been clear. They're moving 60% of the naval forces and 60% of air forces to Asia to contain China. Well, I don't think we have to think that China is a great nation. I think we can recognize that what it's doing in relationship to the South China Sea has some imperial dimensions. Ask the Filipinos, ask the Vietnamese. I mean, it's somewhat complicated, which brings us back to where I began. And I think what we have to take very seriously in terms of how dangerous the moment is that we're in a period that is in many ways analogous to the approach of World War I, where you had competing capitalist nations with different systems, grand ambitions, and a situation in which you had declining powers and rising powers. And I would argue that the Cold War in many ways ended on the basis of the concept of common security. Olof Palme, as we're approaching nuclear cataclysm, brought together leading Soviet figures, leading European figures, some leading American figures, and they said, look, we've got to name what are our deepest fears as we're in this confrontation, and then we have to do the hard-headed negotiations of what will assure one another's security without making things more dangerous for anybody. And you ended up then with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which before the fall of the Berlin Wall, I would argue, really ended the Cold War. And I think we need to kind of hold up as a vision, as opposed to the imperial vision, I think a realistic vision of the possibility of common security. We don't have the right to be overthrowing governments. We may not like some of these other governments, but we don't have the right to overthrow them. Every country, every people has the right to self-determination.
I tried to get something going at Veterans for Peace against NATO, and I was told that's pie in the sky, right? Which I thought, and I still say today, that this is an important part, it should be an important issue that Veterans for Peace should pick up. And basically I was ineffective, I couldn't get it through. But the point was being, I know there's probably a lot of angst in Europe, and other places about Europe and NATO membership. Are there any movements in Europe right now, in NATO countries in particular? I know you have Shannon Watch in Ireland, but you have, are there other organizations that are working for the abolishment of NATO?
Go ahead. Yeah, so to say, since about 2008, I've had the privilege of working with groups in this No to NATO, No to War network. It's principally European. The Irish have been involved, but strong participation from Germans, from Swedes, from Finland recently, Italy, Spain. I mean, at the moment, I mean, the most immediate crisis, two most immediate crises in Europe right now are obviously the austerity and the pressures of Greece and what's happening with that, plus the immigrant, the refugee crisis. So for a moment, people's energy is not entirely focused on NATO. But I think in terms of war and peace, their focus, the peace movement focus there, has been NATO, because this is what drives them into war. This is what demands the militarization of their society. This is what brings all those military bases there. And again, I mean, most people here in this country have no concept that we have more than 800 military bases around the world. If you go and visit with people who live near these bases, what you hear is about, and it goes back to our Declaration of Independence, the abuses and usurpations that follow with these bases. Whether there was just now a murder in Okinawa of yet another Okinawan woman by a former Marine. You've got crime, you've got sexual harassment, you've got low altitude flights that are coming right over people's homes at night or over schools in the day. They can't talk. Accidents that take place, military accidents that take place. Their engagement in U.S. wars because of the presence of NATO in the bases. So it's a range of pieces. But in Europe NATO has been the principal focus of the peace movement.
Is there anywhere we could, like, people we can reach out to?
Sure. So if you signed up on that piece going on the list going around, I'll send you information about the counter summit in Poland, and talk to your friends, raise some money, and come to Warsaw.
I'll talk to Forrest.
Okay.
Do you think there's an economic connection? Because like I hear on the internet that the dollar as the reserve currency is being threatened. Do you think that there's an economic cause for our recent aggressiveness?
Well, that aggressiveness has always had economic reasons. I mean, there's nothing new in there. The question is, some of these aggressions are triggered for economic reasons. There's a lot of talk about Saddam Hussein trying to convert the petrodollars to petro-euros, the Iraqi, and they said they were talking about Gaddafi trying to do the same thing, and also the Iranian government trying to do the same thing. And you will see these aggressive measures against these countries exactly because of all those things. There's another economic reason, if you not look at it from, when you say economic from financial point of view, but economic in general sense, it's a question of resources. And that has been another source of increased aggressiveness. One issue, there's a generally agreed theory about peak oil. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That predicts that by 2030, 2040, the total production of oil will drop to 1/2, while the total demand, global demand for oil will double. The drop in the supply of oil in the production is a result of depletion of the reserves. And it's predicted that these reserves are drying up at a much faster rate outside Middle East. And by 2030, 2040, Middle East will be supplying 80 to 85% of the global oil needs. So just imagine that and think about why we are doing all this in the Middle East. Because whoever controls that supply in 20, 30 years controls the world. You can choke China with that. You can choke EU with that. You can choke Japan with that. So whoever has the control over that supply, and when we talk about people thinking in terms of, oh, the Iraq war was for oil, they generally assume that it was because we want to drive our SUVs. But that's not the question. Yes, it was over oil, but it was over control over the supply of oil. Who will get it and who will not get it? And just imagine when U.S. military is going to be sitting on top of Iraqi oil, Kuwaiti oil, Saudi oil, right? And next time they're moving to do with Iran the same thing.
Venezuela.
Right? And Venezuela, that's another plan. They have already covered everything that would be left in 20, 30 years. And then U.S. military would be in charge of distribution of oil in the world, not oil companies. So the aggression, the rush today to control is based on that projection.
Okay. You, sir?
Yeah, my name is David Young from the Greater New Haven Peace Council. I just maybe kind of going back to what you were saying about China a little bit. I'm going to ask the question whether people in this act are making connections in terms of the economic policies as well as the foreign policy and how they're linked together. In my opinion, in the real world, not the fake propaganda world of war propaganda, in the real world, the chief rival of the United States is China, because they are an economic power, great economic power. And I think that a lot of these policies are geared towards getting a hedge against China. I see this particularly with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Developing trade relations with these Asian countries secretly, trying to get a hedge against the competitor, the main competitor, China. and the fact that we're trying to isolate countries like Iran, which is a trading partner of China, and Syria, which is a trading partner of Russia. And they were trying to form an economic bloc, the BRICS. So I just wondering if you're making the economic connections here, and that this is a factor in these policies of NATO, these aggression of, if we could do a regime change in Iran, Syria, maybe even Russia, we're going to be on top, and we'll have to hedge against. It's all insane, of course, but I think this is what's driving is that the chief economic rival, China.
So I would agree that the main competition is between the United States and China. That explains the pivot to Asia, and that's Hillary's focus. Actually, I wrote an article, about a year ago about TPP, and I have to say that organized labor wasn't happy about it. They didn't want the Democrats to hear it because I think at root in TPP, it's in many ways less about the economic relations, although that's there. It's more about more deeply integrating the economies and the cultures of the nations of Asia Pacific into that of the United States in order to turn them away from China, which, for example, at South Korea. So I would say that that's fundamental, and I think what we see is that Obama looks to be on the cusp of a rather serious defeat in relationship to TPP. I think because of the political opposition here in the United States, I mean, look, Hillary had to turn against it. She may turn again, but I think the foundations socially here are against that. Two other pieces in terms of the European Union and China. The system of economic relations and political relations is rife with contradictions. And so we have to appreciate that there are deep economic ties between China and European Union nations. And this is one thing that I think is of concern to the United States, and it helps to understand why the United States has been trying to negotiate that trade agreement that was the TIPP agreement to hold Europe in against the Chinese. But deep economic ties there. And it's the last thing I want to say, maybe a difference here with Bahman. Years ago, Iqbal Ahmed used to say that the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East was the geopolitical center of the struggle for world power, because whoever controlled the Strait of Hormuz controlled the oil. And the use of that oil, you go back to the '73 embargo in Kissinger, the use of that jugular vein is not new, right? I mean, the United States has been using it ever since the deal with Saudi Arabia in 1945. But I think what we're seeing at this point is that the peak oil analysis is coming into question with tar sands and the other nasty pieces, plus the global warming and the transitions to alternative energy. So I think at this point, when we look at what is the geostrategic center of the struggle for world power, I think we're looking at the South China Sea, both because of its amazing resources under there, and because something like, 60% of world trade moves across the South China Sea, including oil from the Middle East. And so that has become the real focus. And I have to say, I was at we did a conference, 3 years ago, with a Chinese partner organization. And I wanted to include discussion of the South China Sea. Our Chinese partners did not want to. I insisted. So we ended up having, what they did was to send one of their top maritime international law governmental figures to be their speaker on this. And we had a workshop in which he spoke. We also had leading figures from the Philippines and Vietnam on that panel. And in the audience was maybe half Vietnamese. You can appreciate that these people were not particularly happy with what the Chinese speaker had to say. Pushed back really quite hard. And then something really quite remarkable happened. He said, look, it doesn't matter what you say. In a few years, your economies are going to be so dependent on us, you won't have a choice. So it's interesting the dynamics that are taking place, and I think that poses some of the challenge to us in terms of how we find a way forward that is anti-imperialist in all its forms and supportive of rights and self-determination.
Just one word. I don't think NATO could run its airplanes, ships, and tanks on solar panels, right? They're still going to need that oil, right? And, just one understanding of the scale of things. My understanding is that any of these tanks that we have now, what is called Sherman or whatever it is called, they burn 8 gallons of gas per mile, not 8 miles per gallon, right? Just imagine 100 of them going from Kuwait City to Baghdad in one day, right? How many gallons are we talking about? And it's just one small thing, right? Compared to the war that has been going on for years and years, right? Just imagine the need for fossil fuels for maintaining the military domination. So it's not going to go away regardless of how many good solar panels you make.
Okay. I've got a stack going, so, yeah.
Ron Duncan, Queen's Peace Council. I was interested in the association between before the First World War and today, and I've heard that perhaps the reason for the First World War was not the going for resources, but in fact because the working class, the unions and all that had got together, the upper classes were in danger, and that perhaps the reason for the First World War was in fact to wipe out large portions of the population, and so that Russia didn't manage it quite fast enough, and bingo, their ruling class was gone. But right now we're getting to a stage where world population is 7 billion, where the world has become overpopulated, and so it's a very Saturnine kind of similarity, where when you say like 8 gallons per mile, they know that you can't continue to burn fossil fuels at that rate because global warming is going to have us without any water, so perhaps the time has come, like the First World War, to wipe out half of the population of the Earth, basically.
Yes, I guess I won't go to that degree of conspiratorial theory. And I'm trying to remember, someone's going to help me here with the name of the man he wrote both Leopold's Ghost and...
Adam Hochschild.
Sorry? Yeah, Hochschild. Wrote a book called War to End All Wars.
Yeah.
And I think what you see, there are all kinds of things going on, right? But at the heart of it, you have these interlocking alliances. The only country that really wanted to go to war was Germany. And you've had both miscalculations, and you had the kind of structures they had for going to war, in part related to kind of rail systems that they had, the technologies that they had. So in the class stuff, he goes beautifully into what happened in Britain, with the ruling class and sending people off to war, the illusions that the upper class had. But I wouldn't go to that level. I think look, the reality is that the human species faces 2 existential crises. One is nuclear war, and the other is climate change. We're not responding to them in any way that we should. Look, they're talking now about Miami being one of the 10 most vulnerable cities in the world, and we're here in New York, and people will remember Hurricane Sandy, right? It's going to be more and more of this, and instead of defending our coastal civilization, because it's a coastal, the United States is a coastal civilization, unless we invest probably trillions of dollars needed to protect our cities. And where does that money come from? Well, part of it is taxing the rich, and the other part of it is that obscene military spending. Yeah, and that's one way in which imperialism is killing us, and killing our grandchildren. So I would look at it that way.
Okay, I think you're next. Okay.
Joe Lombardo from the United National Anti-War Coalition. I want to thank the speakers for the real informative presentations. And I really like the way Bahman framed it as an imperialist anti-war movement is the kind of movement that we need. Joseph mentioned how we have somewhere around 800 bases. The numbers fluctuate all over. There's these small lily pad bases and so forth. So Pentagon says around 680. Others say up to 1,000. But in either case, when you think about it, the United States of America has around 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. And when you think about that, some of the things, like it doesn't make sense to equate U.S. war games and Russian war games because, well, first of all, those war games from the U.S. are on the border of Russia. And so when it does a flyover in the Black Sea, what the hell is the United States doing in the Black Sea? What would happen if the Russians were doing war games in the Gulf of Mexico? So you have to think about this. And when you think of it as an anti-imperialist war movement, you have to say, well, where is the major imperialist country? Because if you do start thinking of good guys and bad guys, they're all bad guys. There's no real good guys in these things. And they get vilified, and it confuses us. We just see the confusion in the anti-war movement over what's going on in Syria, what's going on in other places in the world. There's bad guys and good guys. So I think it's really incumbent upon the anti-war movement in the United States for us to